Alex Pollock of the R Street Institute, and it's a pleasure for Andrew Biggs and me to welcome you to our conference on what's in store for Social Security as we review the 2017 report of the Social Security Board of Trustees and related issues, which are big, needless to say. The numbers show us that Social Security went cash flow negative in 2010, has stayed and will permanently stay that way under current rules. And under those rules in 2034, scheduled benefits, which legally are neither promised nor a commitment, would, if the law remains the same, need to be substantially cut. 2034 is 17 years from now, dare we say only 17 years. So if you are 50 years old today, you can look forward to the cuts just as you hit your full retirement age. And if that is, if the law isn't changed. And if you are 40 or 30 or 25, you could look forward to paying in for many years at the same level as now, but receiving a lot less. This hugely important topic grows more difficult as longevity expands, birth rates stay low, the age distribution shifts toward older cohorts, and as retirements grow longer and represent a greater proportion of life. If, for example, you begin work at 22, work to 62, a typical retirement age, and live to 92, you will have worked for 40 years and then been retired for 30 years, expecting to be paid without working for 75% as long as you worked. In my view, no retirement finance structure of any kind can survive that kind of math, and we face a situation never dreamed possible by the original designers of Social Security, of course. And there are many things which could be done to change this future outcome, this projection, as we'll be discussing today. We'll begin with a keynote address on the actuarial status of Social Security by Steve Goss. Paul Van de Water and Andrew Biggs will be discussants. We'll give a chance for Steve to reply to them and the panel to exchange ideas, then open the floor to your questions. We'll adjourn at 3:30, but members of the panel will be around afterwards for continuing informal discussions if you wish. Let me introduce our keynote speaker who's up here with me. Steve Goss is the Chief Actuary of the Social Security Administration. Our responsibility is held since 2001. He joined the office of the Chief Actuary in 1973 after earning degrees in mathematics and economics, and worked in areas related to health insurance, long-term care insurance, pension, disability and survivor protection, and as a member of the Society of Actuaries, the American Academy of Actuaries, the National Academy of Social Insurance, the Social Insurance Committee of the American Academy of Actuaries, the Social Security Retirement and Disability Income Committee of the Society of Actuaries, and there is nobody more expert in how the complex numbers of Social Security actually work. Steve, we're delighted to have you with us. Thank you for coming, and welcome to the AEI conference here.
Well, thank you, Alex. Thank you for the opportunity. First little item just to mention is actually Social Security did go so-called cash flow negative. That means that the amount that we're paying out started to exceed the amount of tax revenue coming in, not counting interest in 2010. But under current law, that won't be permanent, because under current law in 2034 for the combined trust funds, when we depleted the reserves, we would at that point and from then forward, if the law's not changed, be able to pay out not 1 penny more each day, each year than the money coming in. So we'd cease to go cash flow negative under current law at that point. Let me just run you through a little bit of what's going on with the most recent trustees report, which just came out last week. First of all, why do we do the trustees reports? We've done them consistently. Not we, but people and our forefathers and mothers have been doing them consistently every single year since 1941 because the law requires it. The law requires that the trustees put forth a report speaking to what the financial operations have been for the most recent single year, the next 5 years, and what the actuarial status of the program is. Actuarial status, exactly precisely defined, has morphed a little bit over time, but at this point, largely speaking, it's what's the prospects for the next 75 years. is there scheduled in current law enough revenue to be able to pay all of the currently scheduled benefits in full and on time? And that's really what the trustees report is all about, is to tell Congress whether or not that is the case. If it's not the case and there's a shortfall, when the shortfall occurs, how big it's going to be, and that gives them the roadmap to what they're going to have to do to avert hitting the point where we would deplete reserves. And by the way, we have never depleted the reserves and as a result been in a position where we failed to be able to pay full scheduled benefits on a timely basis. And there's a lot of reason to believe that we will never hit such a point. Imagine yourselves as members of Congress, high priority that your constituents will continue to get their benefits. Okay, so flipping to what really is the biggest metrics, the biggest indicator of what we oftentimes call solvency. Solvency is kind of a tricky term. When we think about a private firm, when a firm ceases to be solvent, close down the doors, nothing. It's all gone. Go to Chapter 11, whatever. Social Security, solvency is almost a poor choice of word. All solvency really means at any point in time is that we have the money available in our reserves, in our trust funds, to be able to pay all the scheduled benefits at that point in time in full and on a timely basis. Again, if we ever reach the point of reserve depletion, which you see with these curves, when they get down to zero, that's a point where the reserves would be projected, in the absence of any change in law, to be depleted, at which point the ability to pay full benefits on a timely basis would no longer be there. You can see the black lines for the combined OESI and DI programs. We oftentimes look at them on a combined basis, even though they are two separate trust funds, just for simplicity's sake. And you can see in this year's trustees report, like last year's trustees report, 2034, as Alex mentioned, is the year in which we're projecting to deplete the reserves. For the OESI program as a whole, this year, as last year, 2035. DI is the somewhat more interesting item here. In DI, you see the light blue line at the bottom, the trust fund reserves. By the way, this trust fund ratio is the amount of money we have in reserves, sort of like our bank account, divided by the annual cost of the program. Generally speaking, for a pay-as-you-go funded system where we have no borrowing authority, an important point about these trust funds, you want to see a cushion. You want to have what we call a contingency reserve, about 1 year's worth of outgo in the reserves. So DI was moving towards depletion back in 1994. We had remedial legislation that reallocated a tax rate somewhat between OESI and DI. No change in the total, just put a little bit more into DI. And you can see it pulled DI back up. We were projecting at the time that would carry us to 2016. Lo and behold, as 2016 actually approached, that was still our projection, and another remedial action was necessary back in the Bipartisan Budget Act of 2015, where they did a little bit more, very temporary reallocation, just 3 years, that you see gives us the extra bump. Now, the dashed line is what we had in the 2016 trustees report a year ago, and you can see we were projecting at that time that the reserves would be pushed out from an initial expectation of depletion before that latest tax rate reallocation of 2016 out to 2023. Our latest projections, though, and we'll get more into this in just a moment, are not projecting not 2023, but 2028. Okay, so where are we going in this? Well, disability applications, this is quite an interesting story. This is just the gross number of applications coming into disability termination services for the DI program, for Social Security. And you can see back in the heydays of the peak of the last economic cycle, which is 2007, just before the downturn started for the recession, we were down there, below 1.6 million per year applications. Things were good. Along comes a recession, no big surprise, a lot of people lose their jobs. If they see any possible way that they could find another source of income, they will, of course, pursue it. So we had a big jump up in applications. We peaked out at over 2 million per year in 2010. Now, what's happened since then, and by the way, we also have stuff up on the website you might want to take a look at that shows that when we have a surge in applications and a recession, we tend to have a almost commensurate drop in the percentage of those applications that get allowed. Really speaks to sort of the consistency of application of the definition. So we have seen a drop in the applications since then. You can see we have the lines here of what we were projecting for applications to drop in the 2012 trustees report 5 years ago. 13, 14, 15, and 16 trustees report, and you can see reality has really been falling way short of what our expectations for applications. We are now, in fact, at a level of applications for the year 2016 below the level we had back in 2007 at the peak of the economic recovery. And that's significant because when we look at, here's one sort of metric of where we are in the state of the economic recovery, we are suggesting at this point by our underlying assumptions that we are still 2% short of having employment at the level of what we'd call the sort of sustainable full employment level. And remember, the sustainable full employment level, that's sort of the steady state level you might expect to be at under sort of a nice steady state economy. If we ever reach to the point where we cross that and go into an overheated economy like we had in 2007, we would go above the 1.0 line here. So we're still way below that, and yet we nonetheless have applications well below the level of 2007. And just going back, below the levels we've been expecting for quite a while. Now, you can see in these applications, we have been in prior trustees reports assuming we would jump back up to the levels of the prior trustees report pretty quickly. We finally came to the point here where we're realizing that there's something a little bit more going on here than just the economic cycle. So what we're still going up on the applications in the future, but taking a little bit longer to get there. Now, okay, now we're not getting the clicker working anymore. There we go, okay. We got to point it. I'm not sure where I'm supposed to point it. Up there? It's backwards? Okay. Okay, so here's the next slide. This looks a little bit like that application slide. This is disability incidence rates, which is just the percentage of people in our population who are insured, not already receiving a benefit, who start receiving a benefit in that year. And now this is really kind of a better slide to look at than the applications because this is on age, sex adjusted disability incidence rate. So changing age distribution of the population doesn't matter here. You can see it bounces up and down, same old thing. 2010 it went way up, but now it's been coming down and down and down. And remember, we're not even back to the point of the sort of midline of the economy, and our disability incidence rate as of 2016 is way below where we've been anytime recently. Now, as a result, what we've done is we are still, we as you know, mentioned to Andrew and Paul a little bit earlier, for the 2017 Trustees Report, the trustees decided not to make any changes in the underlying ultimate assumptions. And you see for the disability incidence rate, we come back up to the 5.4 per thousand insured workers exposed to the possibility of becoming disabled, that we still get there at the end of 10 years, but we're getting there a little bit more gradually here. We continue to be surprised. And by the way, I have to tell you, as we get into the year 2017, the first 39 weeks of 2017, fiscal year 2017, compared to the first 39 weeks of fiscal year 2016, we are, I believe the number is 5% lower in applications than we had a year earlier. So we're continuing to have this downward trend on applications. And SSI applications, 6% down from the number we had in the first 39 weeks of 2016. So with all of this, you can see having this much, much lower level of applications, incidents, and going up a little more gradually to the same level. What does this do in terms of the number of disabled worker beneficiaries actually on our rolls? Well, while applications, as you saw before, have been literally dropping since 2010, the number of people on our DI rolls receiving benefits has been dropping since 2013, steadily. And you can see that here about how it peaked and it's been coming down. Now we are projecting, because we're assuming still we're going to come back to the same higher level of incidence rates, that this is going to turn around and we'll start growing the number of disabled workers. And eventually it would reach the levels that we had before. But it's going to take quite a while because we've had this dearth of individuals coming in and a little bit slower rate of getting back to the ultimate disability incidence rates. Okay, so the DI annual cost, this is no longer sort of comparing to last year's Trustees Report, but the outgrowth of what we have now. And on this, you can see this is the DI annual cost in blue as a percentage of, in this case, of our taxable payroll. That is all the earnings that everybody has up to the $127,200 tax max. And the blue line is what the cost of the program is, except for when we hit the reserve depletion date, 2028. Then the cost of paying the full benefits continues to the right on a dashed line. And we have the blue line drop down at the point, as Alex and I were talking about, where actually there is no more cash flow issue, because remember, the trust funds can't spend a penny more than they have available in them. So if we did reach the point of reserve depletion for DI with no action between now and then, and our assumptions come true, then we would reach a point in 2028 where we couldn't spend anything more than the money coming in. And what that would mean is we would have 93 cents revenue coming in after reserve depletion for every dollar of scheduled benefits. Exactly how we'd handle that, who knows? But again, the reason we can't answer what exactly would happen is because we've never, ever hit that point. Congress has always stopped us short of that point. Now, for the OESDI program as a whole, the thing that we generally are looking at more, the picture looks similar, much the same as it has in recent years. You can see our blue line, the cost of the program is rising up a lot over the next 20 years for reasons I think we all understand about aging. And we reach the point where we will use up our reserves. By the way, the reserves for the two programs right now are $2.85 trillion. Sounds like a lot, but these are big programs. So when we use up those reserves, we will drop down to the point, again, where we'll no longer have a cash flow issue because we would not be able to pay anything more out as of 2034 for the combined program than we had coming in. And that would mean for the combined program, at that point, we'd only have 77 cents for every dollar of scheduled benefits. And over time, because of some slight changes in the future, for the program, it would drop down to 73 cents for every dollar. So this is really what is confronting Congress. This is what they have to face for making changes. Now, we oftentimes show, just to sort of juxtapose against solvency, there's also the concept people talk about is this a sustainable program? Well, we know that what's not sustainable. What's not sustainable is paying the full scheduled benefits with only the full scheduled revenue. But is it a sustainable program? It's kind of a different question. I mean, back in the day, some in the room will remember we used to have for the Medicare program projections of the cost of the program as a percentage of GDP just going up. Slope was just going up forever. Well, that's like not sustainable. But a program which levels off in terms of its cost at some level would appear to be sustainable. The question is whether the American people and their elected representatives want to come up with a revenue to pay that full cost, or whether they want to pull down the cost of it to meet the revenue that we have on scheduled in current law. That's the choice that we will be faced with. Now, explaining why this run-up in the cost of the program, especially over the next 20 years, well, you can look at the thing that most fundamentally drives it, the ratio of number of beneficiaries we have per 100 workers, and you can see that has that same next 20 years it runs up. Why? Well, the reason is because of aging of the population. And I'll bet if we did a secret ballot here and everybody said, what does aging mean for the population? Well, people living longer. That's some of it. That's part of it. But take a look at this graph. This is what we call the age dependency ratio. The ratio of the number of people 65 and older, something like our beneficiaries, to the number of working age folks in the population, 20 to 64. And you can see on the black line, that's what we're projecting it's actually going to be doing over the next 20 years. That's quite a big hop, quite a big level shift. Now, had the birth rates after 1964 stayed at the level that they had been during the baby boom generation, 3.3 children per woman, or even at 3 children per woman, you can see the other two lines of what we would be doing at this age dependency ratio. Had the birth rate stayed up, then we wouldn't have this hop that we're having over the next 20 years. And as a result, we would not really be talking nearly so much about the shortfall that we have for Social Security. Now, this is not to blame people for not having enough kids, because I'm old enough, and maybe some of us in the audience remember a guy named Malthus, who was saying that we're going to overpopulate the world and we'd all run out of food. So we've averted that problem, but we have a different challenge now. And the challenge we have is to address what happens when we have more back to birth rates more at like the replacement level and not having birth rates that are causing a really growing population. Okay, the DI cost as percentage of GDP, just wanted to share this with you. In our projections, it was rising for a long period of time. Why? Because those baby boomers were moving up from the youngest working ages to the older working ages where people tend to be more likely to get disabled. And this is very predictable. We knew this, we'd projected this, and we knew that it would reach the point where the baby boomers would all sort of max out on being up at the higher ages. And when they started moving out, the age distribution would stabilize, and then the cost rate would stabilize also as a percentage of GDP. Now you can see the blue line, the hop that we have, that's called a recession. Under a recession, we have more people coming on. And by the way, I don't think we have the slide in here, but the biggest part of the elevation of the cost as percent of GDP was a lower level of GDP, not a higher level of cost. I think it was over 90% of the elevation of this line was because of a loss of GDP, which of course is what you expect to see in a recession. This sort of very colorful graph really sort of shows you the story of what happened maybe even more with disability than with what's coming up. If you look between 1970 and 1990, look at the sort of orangish, reddish, whatever the color that sort of that middle band is. That's the prime disability age sort of bracket, 45 to 64. And that age group, you can see, has a share of all the adult population, and especially of the adult population from 25 to 65, the working age population. You can see how it was shrinking. So those were the good days for the cost of disability. You would expect the cost of disability to be stable or even declining, as it was. But then, between 1990 and 2010, nobody should be surprised that the cost of disability relative to GDP, payroll, whatever, was growing. Look at the age shift, the changing age distribution. 45 to 64 was becoming a very large increasing share of the working age population. So obviously, you would expect to have a lot more disabled workers relative to workers out there in the economy and the population, and that's exactly what it had. But you can see also, after 2010, that doesn't just continue. So you can't put a ruler on the trend of what happened from 1990 to 2010. You have to look at what actually the underlying driving demographics are, and that's why we've really had a leveling and now a declining number of people receiving disabled worker benefits, and it's really not going to be growing as a share of GDP in the future. Now, another thing that's really, really important for Social Security, we mentioned the birth rate, but another thing is, in fact, aging, the portion of it that comes from people living longer. This is a little look at mortality experience. This is the age sex-adjusted death rate for all ages, 0 all the way up. And you can see that, we like to see that going down. All of us who, are alive and want to stay that way as long as possible, love to see that thing going down. But we can see here between about, 2000 and 2009, it was going down at a pretty heady pace. And a lot of people are saying, well, this is going to go on forever. Nobody's going to die. We're going to have incredible increases in longevity, and lots of people were projecting that. We, as people in this audience who have been involved with the trustees process, well know and understand, we try to sort of look at longer-term trends and not get too excited about what's happened most recently. If we did, we'd get really worried, because look at how this has kind of leveled off since 2009. Mortality rates have not been dropping anywhere near as fast as they were, and in addition, you can see that they've been dropping at a much slower rate than we have been projecting. So people have been projecting faster mortality improvement than us. That's kind of like an issue. So even we have been over-projecting mortality improvement. If you look at the age group that's probably more germane to the cost of this program, 65 and over, it's even more extreme. We've had an even greater leveling off since 2009. You can see our projections for the 2015, 16, 17 trustees reports are sort of going back to the longer-term trend. We don't know how long this sort of leveling off is going to be. We have one of the slides that we just recently, sorry it's not in here, it's for the under 65, and actually since 2009, the little black triangles, they're actually going up. For the under 65 age sex-adjusted mortality rates, actually been going up since 2009. Okay, principal reasons, just to be really quick on this. Principal reasons for the change in the long term. For the long-term projection, we have this thing called the actuarial balance or the actuarial deficit. And that changed from 2.66% of payroll up to 2.83% of payroll in this year's trustees report. And a way of thinking about that is, well, we've got a 12.4% tax rate. Roughly speaking, if we have a 2.66 or 2.83% of payroll shortfall, that's roughly about how much you'd have to add onto the tax rate if you want to pay for all the scheduled benefits over the next 75 years. So putting it in those terms, understand that our actuarial deficit in this year's trustees report was increased by 0.17%, from 2.66 to 2.83 from last year. Not a big move. I think in the prior year we actually had it come down. About a third of that was just because of this changing valuation period. We do a 75-year projection. So a year goes by, we start up another trustees report, and we go one more year into the future. It gets included in the 75 years. And that actually increases the actual deficit by about 0.05, about a third of the whole increase. You can see on the mortality has actually been improving the finances of Social Security, and it did again in this year's trustees report. However, on the demographics, we've continued to have lower than ultimately expected birth rates, and also recently we've had lower net immigration into the country. And those two combined, as they focus in to our projections, to actually have the deficit be a little bit bigger. There are some other smaller things. One thing we did this year, even though we didn't change ultimate assumptions, we've all recognized that labor productivity, this has been much discussed, has really fallen short of expectations, its growth during the recession and during the recovery. So what we did do is we have adopted another 1 percentage point lower level of potential GDP, of labor productivity, going into the future relative to what we had in last year's trustees report. We are hoping to be pleasantly surprised and find that that was a big mistake. Assume we're going to have a lower ultimate level, not of growth, but level of productivity and labor productivity and GDP. But we sort of adopted a portion of some of the shortfall relative to expectation that we've had in economic growth during the recession and recovery.
While you're clicking, this is your 4-minute warning.
Oh, okay, great. Well, we'll sort of step it up. I think we're at slide 19. I think we're about on pace. So, and this will be a short one. Uncertainty, just in case you're wondering, do we think the trustees and we know with certainty what's going to happen in the future? Not a chance. So we have several different ways of sort of projecting the differentials that might occur in the future. This just illustrates two of them. The solid lines here show you the results of our stats people, 95% confidence interval in effect, expectation for the cost of the program as a percentage of payroll going into the future from our stochastic model. Now we also just have some scenario-based models that are sort of second, actually probably our primary way of showing possible deviations in the future, where we take most of the assumptions, have them either be a little bit more towards high cost or low cost, and you can see actually the results from these are coming out fairly similar. The one further thing that a lot of people find interesting, we have a sensitivity analysis in the trustees report that shows what the implications of changing one ultimate assumption at a time are on the long-term costs of the program. So if you're interested, you could go back and take a peek at those. Now, we also have, well, they're no longer in the trustees report. These are in the trustees report for a long, long time, but 3-4 years ago, something like this, they were out of the trustees report. We still have these provided in an actuarial note put up on the website showing one version of looking at sort of the sort of relative level of the benefits. And the level of the benefits that we have illustrated in there is something that's kind of like most appropriate, perhaps, to the nature of this program. It's the benefit level a person would expect to start getting, in this case, retiring at 65, who had a career average earnings level at some particular level. And the career average earnings level we look at is essentially the AIME, which is the basis for determining benefits, average index monthly earnings for people. And you can see for a low earner, which here is about the 25th percentile, retiring at 65, they get about 50% as much as they had been earning across their career. For a maximum earner who's at the top of the distribution, it's more like about 25%. Now, if we look at age 62, Alex has mentioned people coming at 62, and by the way, kind of a good news story here, the percentage of people taking benefits as early as 62 has been dropping ever since the 1990s for both men and women. People really are moving up to higher ages at which they're starting their benefits, which means they have less reduction for having early start. And you can see this, you can see on this one, the higher earner would get 50% at 65, but if they start at 62 for the rest of their life, they'll only get 40% of what their career average is. So these reductions, which are permanent for life, are really significant. And then we have one little other graph here, which is that if Congress really does nothing, and we do deplete the reserves in 2034, what happens to these benefit replacement rates, assuming that benefits are just paid proportionately less by roughly 25%. Okay, now one of the things just wanted to mention, because this has been stated in the actuarial opinion at the back of the report, another item required in law. There has been since, 2014, I think, some reference in the Social Security OSDI Trustees Report to the budget scoring convention, which is wonderful in its own right, and I'm sure a lot of people love it, but the problem with the budget scoring convention, it's simply inconsistent with trust fund accounting. In trust fund accounting, as stated here, and as Congress well understands, if we ever deplete the reserves, we cannot pay all the benefits, we can't borrow, and that's what motivates them to act every single time in the past, and we have full expectation in the future. The budget scoring convention assumes something fairly different. It assumes that if we ever reach the point of reserve depletion, we will just keep paying all the scheduled benefits, and money just kind of like shows up from the general fund of the Treasury, resulting in lots and lots of borrowing from the public. So when you see these, publicly held debt numbers going in the future, and it says entitlements are causing this, well, that could, but it would require a change in the law saying that all shortfalls are going to be covered by money just coming from the general fund. So not only does the current law not permit that, but the law has never permitted that. We have no example of that happening in the past. So the bottom line is really, pay attention to what we've got. So how to fix Social Security?
You've got 2 minutes to fix it now.
Oh, I think two minutes will be great. Well, it might take Congress a little bit longer, but a lot of people in this room are well aware of all the options that can be considered, and it's really fairly simple. In the future, we're expecting, under current law, the revenues coming into the program, all the tax revenues, to be about 4.6, 4.8, something in that range, percent of GDP. But the cost of the program, again, after the baby boomers move into retirement, we have this big age shift in our age distribution. We're going to be at about 6 to 6.1% of GDP for the cost of the program. So Congress really has, well, it's not a simple, but it has a fairly straightforward situation to face. They've got to either lower the level of scheduled benefits by about a quarter, by the time we get to 2034, or raise the revenue by about a third, or some combination of the two. And if you are a student of history and you go back to the 1983 amendments and other amendments, you'll see that every time we've had a situation like this, Congress has wrestled with it, they come to a conclusion, usually a little bit of this, a little bit of that, some kind of distribution. We've had a lot of proposals, Bipartisan Policy Center, the Simpson-Bowles Commission. They've all looked at ways of sort of attacking this. So ways to lower cost, and I'll just not really take a lot of time on this because we don't have a lot of time. Alexis is going to give me the hook here shortly. But there are a number of ways that members of Congress have considered for lowering cost. There are a number of ways that they've looked at for raising revenue, increasing the taxable maximum, et cetera, lowering cost, increasing the normal retirement age, all kinds of possibilities. And I guess the thing I would want to close on, if any of what has been said here or will be said in the remainder of this session piques your interest and you want to learn more about this, please go to our little website, SSA, at www.ssa.gov/OACT, and you will see all the things listed on this slide there, including the scoring we have done for comprehensive proposals from a great variety of members of Congress who have very different ideas about how they want to change the program to eliminate this long-term deficit. And also we break down all the individual provisions of all of their proposals into a provisions list. So you can pick them off one at a time, treat it as a cookbook, and come up with your own solution for eliminating the shortfall for Social Security. And with that, I look forward to the comments and discussion.
Thank you very much, Steve. We'll ask our discussants to come join us, please.
Or can I just leave this up so you all can?
We'll leave it up.
Oh, okay.
Maybe someone wants to write it down.
Okay.
You'll also be able to see it on the AEI website, where we'll all be recorded for you and for posterity. Let me introduce our discussants, and then we'll go into their discussion. First will be Paul Van de Water, who's a senior fellow and director of policy futures at the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, where he specializes in Medicare, Social Security, and health coverage issues. Previously, he was vice president for health policy at the National Academy of Social Insurance, and assistant deputy commissioner for policy at the Social Security Administration. He was in the Congressional Budget Office for 18 years and supervised agency budget projections, analyses of the president's budget, and cost estimates of legislative proposals. And I think we can presume knows his way around complicated numbers. Next will be Andrew Biggs, who is a resident scholar at the American Enterprise Institute, where he focuses on Social Security reform, as well as state and local government pensions and all their problems. Previously, Andrew was the principal deputy commissioner of the Social Security Administration, overseeing policy research, and an associate director of the White House National Economic Council. He was named by Institutional Investor magazine to its 2014 list of the most influential people in retirement policy, and is also a member of the Oversight Board, which is managing financial reforms in Puerto Rico, including Puerto Rico's entirely unfunded public employee pension plans. And Andrew has organized this conference. Thank you very much, Andrew. Paul, you have the floor.
Thank you, Alex. I believe my slides are not included in the overhead package.
We didn't get you in them?
Pardon? But I think you have printed copies, although I hope the presentation will be understandable without reference to the slides. I'm not going to say any.
Hang on just a minute, Paul. Does everybody have the handout here, or can we get them if people don't have?
It looks like most everyone does.
We're all set?
So.
Yeah. Okay. Great.
Oh.
Great. Thanks.
Yes. Okay, I'm sorry. My question included the panel, Steve.
I'm not going to disagree with anything that Steve has said. His presentation was excellent, but I want to focus on a couple of two of the points. First of all, what one might call the new news in the 27 Trustees Report, and then secondly, what might be considered the older and less surprising news. The new news, of course, is the improvement in the short-run financial status of the Disability Insurance Trust Fund, the extension of the depletion date from 2023 to 2028. there has been, Steve showed you a number of graphs to illustrate that, but in the packet, the first slide, you see just a picture of what's happened to the rate of change in the number of disabled worker DI beneficiaries, which has just fallen off substantially and has now, in fact, been negative for several years. That is, the number of DI beneficiaries, as Steve said, has actually been shrinking. Now, as Steve explained, part of this is this decline was attributable to economic and demographic changes that were could be expected, and that the trustees did, in fact, expect. The improvement in the economic situation coming out of the recession reduced the number of new applications. We also had the baby boomers reaching full retirement age, and an increasing number of disability insurance beneficiaries shifting out of the disabled worker category into the retired worker category. But the drop-off, as Steve said, was even greater than would have been expected, simply based on those economic and demographic developments. Now, that of course is good news. There's no two ways about it. But I think that we also don't want to exaggerate the good news. As Steve said, the projections are uncertain, and there's always a possibility that next year or the year after that, we may find that all of a sudden disability incidence rates are ticking up again. I do have to say, I think that what the Office of the Actuary and what the trustees have done in sticking to the same long-run disability incidence rate for the time being makes sense. The general approach, which Steve outlined, of the trustees not making sharp changes in the long-run assumptions in any variable based simply on a year or two or three of new short-run developments, I always thought was a very wise approach. Presumably, if this slowdown continues for a longer period of time, then we may see some changes in the long-run disability incidence rate assumption as well. Now, Steve didn't attempt to give any answers to what was happening. Why was this unexpected slowdown occurring? And I certainly don't have the answer either. I don't want to pretend that I do. But I think one thing that's interesting to note that may have contributed to this is the fact that there's been a drop-off in the allowance rate of applications for DI. Particularly at the administrative law judge hearing level. That rate of allowance at the ALJ level had averaged about 62% over the first decade of this century, over 2000 through 2009, but has now dropped off to about 46% in the past few years. There's also been a much smaller but noticeable drop-off in the allowance rate at the initial level as well, at the disability determination service, from about, I can't read my notes here, from about 37% in the first decade of the century down to about 33%. Now, we don't know, those numbers that are on the second chart in the package that I just cited are based on what we call workload data. That is the number of cases that were actually handled at the Disability Determination Service or by administrative law judges in a particular year. A better way of looking at things is what happens to a cohort of applicants. If you take everyone, for example, who applied for benefits in 2016 compared to 2010, for example. Now, we don't know, we don't have those data for a very recent cohort because a lot, even for people who applied, say, back in 2014, unfortunately, because of the delays in the process, a lot of applications are still in process. But we can expect that because of this decline in allowance rates that show up in the workload data, that's going to show up in the cohort data as well at one point. Now, what this demonstrates is, among other things, is that despite complaints that we've heard in recent years about how a lot of people getting DI benefits, in fact, getting DI benefits is not a simple matter, and it's actually become more difficult in recent years. Another myth of sorts that I'd like to say a few words about is the notion that increases in disability insurance receipt, prior to the recent drop-off, have been a major contributor to declines in labor force participation. You may have heard a lot of discussion about how labor force participation has dropped off in recent years, and some have speculated that disability insurance may be a major contributor to that. All of the data and analyses most of the data and analyses that have been undertaken suggest that that's not the case. The Council of Economic Advisors did an analysis of male labor force participation going back to 1967. For prime-age males, the labor force participation rate over that period dropped off by about 7.5%. But according to the CEA, only about 0.3 of a percentage point of that drop-off could be attributed to DI. There's also a chart in your package that looks at more recent experience since 2000, which is broken down by age and sex. This is thanks to my longtime colleague, Kathy Ruffing. If you look at the drop-offs in labor force participation and the ages at which DI receipt has gone up, you see that most of the drop-off in labor force participation has been at somewhat younger ages, whereas the increase in DI receipt since 2000 on average has been at the higher ages. So you don't even see the kind of matchup that you might expect. Another thing to note is, even to the extent that, and while it's doubtless that DI has had some effect on labor force participation, even to the extent that it has had such an effect, it's not likely to have had a big effect on total earnings or GDP, because the earnings capacity of DI beneficiaries or of marginal beneficiaries through by all research studies is very low, and it's the next to the last slide in the package, which is based on a recent research study by Til van Wachteren and a couple of other analysts, just illustrate that even for DI beneficiaries and denied applicants, the amount of labor force attachment is very small, and even for those with labor force attachment, the amount of earnings is very low. Two more points along the same lines. Steve didn't mention that that his office did an estimate recently at the request of Senator Cotton from Arkansas about what would happen to the long-run Social Security deficit if there was a substantial increase in return to work on the part of DI beneficiaries. And as I recall it, this assumed a threefold increase in return to work, and even that made a difference of only, I think it was less than 0.1 of a percentage point in the long run Social Security deficit. So the likely payoff from additional return to work on the part of disability insurance beneficiaries, as desirable as it would be, is not likely to be extremely large. Final point along the same lines: in the new Trump administration budget, there's a proposal to try out additional ways of encouraging work on the part of disability insurance applicants or beneficiaries. The Trump administration, OMB, assumed that that proposal would generate something like $49 billion in savings over the next 10 years. Then the new CBO estimate of the administration budget, which just came out within the past week, shows that savings as zero. That's my comment on the new news, the change in the DI situation. The old news, of course, is that, again, as Steve also emphasized, that Social Security as a whole is facing a long-run financial shortfall. The combined trust funds are scheduled to be exhausted by 2034. And the total cost of the system, just looking at that cost line on Steve's chart, is estimated to rise from somewhere approaching 5% of GDP today to 6% of GDP in the longer run, and to stay fairly flat at that level. The financial challenge, that does pose a financial challenge, but I would agree with Steve that it is a manageable challenge that could be handled through some combination of reducing benefits or increasing taxes. Now, I just make a couple of comments on that. First of all, tying these two short-term and long-term points together. Social Security retirement benefits and disability benefits are closely connected. They're computed using basically the same benefit formula. There's some differences. There's additional insured status requirements for DI. The people, as we said, are converted from disability insurance to retirement benefits when they hit the full retirement age. There are also interesting complementarities on the distributional side. We're seeing increasing evidence that people with lower education, lower socioeconomic status have higher mortality rates, so that affects reduces the period of time over which they're likely to be receiving retirement benefits. But by the same token, people in those same categories are much more likely to become eligible for disability insurance benefits. So when one is looking at the overall
1 minute.
Progressivity of the system, it's very important to look at both together. So I think it's very important that when we consider Social Security solvency, we not look just at the disability side or at the retirement side separately, but that we view them together. And in fact, the extension of the solvency of DI may actually facilitate a comprehensive look of that sort by not suggesting we need to rush quite as much to handle DI, but that there is we do have a few more years that we can look at things in a more careful manner. Now, as Steve said, there have been a lot of different proposals. Unfortunately, perhaps I shouldn't say unfortunately, but the fact of the matter is that in the current political environment, there are very disparate views on how to handle this shortfall. We see, for example, in Congress, two major pieces of legislation. The chair of the Social Security Subcommittee, Republican Sam Johnson, has a bill which would solve the shortfall entirely through benefit cuts. In fact, more than entirely through benefit cuts. By the same token, the ranking Democrat on the Social Security Subcommittee, Mr. Larson, has a bill that would solve the shortfall solely through tax increases. In fact, more than solely through tax increases, because it includes some benefit enhancements. Now, there exist middle-of-the-road solutions, the Bipartisan Policy Center plan that I'm about to finish, that Steve mentioned, that Jim Lockhart here had a major hand in, is roughly a 50-50 split. And whatever one thinks about that, I think in the current political environment, that doesn't seem to be something that's in the cards very soon. So that even though it might be desirable to get relatively prompt action, to get a reasonable compromise, we may have to get beyond the current political situation.
Thanks, Paul. Andrew.
Well, thank you very much. I have my timer running, so hopefully you will not have to chastise me on this. And thanks to all of you for coming. Obviously, thanks Steve and Paul for your comments as well. Luckily, I'm taking up the rear here, and so I'm just going to kind of jump in on various things that sort of occurred to me from Steve's presentation, from the trustees report as a whole. Obviously, the big kind of interesting news here is the drop in disability. And that's, it's obviously good news, and yet I'm reluctant to jump to too many conclusions until you have some idea what's driving it. Disability is something where there's disagreement to begin with over what has driven the increase in disability rates over time. So a short-term decline is a little bit tough to figure out. Is it a decline in sort of fundamental drivers of disability? Is it a decline or an improvement in the labor market for people at the bottom? Does it have something to do with administrative factors within the agency? I think it'll be interesting to find out how that plays out over time. But I think it's also, it's important to think that despite some short short-term, good news in terms of disability applications, that we still have seen, over time, a long-term rise in disability beneficiary rates, and I think a change in the program. I mean, there is a narrative that will say that the increase in the number of folks on Social Security disability is basically a function of higher female labor force participation, which means higher eligibility for benefits, and also general aging of the population. Steve had a chart which shows how you're getting people pushed into the more disability-prone age brackets, and I don't deny those are big factors. But still, if you think there's been a big change in sort of the character of the program over time. We've had legislative changes, back in the 80s. We've had changes in administrative practices over time in terms of how decisions are made within the agency. I mean, it's not. There is this standard of, well, it's you're medically unable to work. In the law, but the reality is there's a lot more going on than that. There are medical factors, there are economic considerations going on. So there's a lot of different things happening there. We've seen a big change in the reasons why people are on disability. If you look in the statistics of what's the category under which you became disabled. So I'm a little reluctant, and I just say I know there's going to be a narrative saying, well, all is well. Don't worry about disability, but the reality is all is not well. Just to pull out some numbers that I ran yesterday. These are from current population survey, but I looked at individuals aged 50 to 54, males. So there you're controlling for age, you're controlling for the gender issue. If you look at the self-reported disability rate, the data I had went back only to 1988. The self-reported disability rate is right about even. If you ask people, do you have a disability that limits your work? And it's somewhere around 8% or so of people say yes. The employment rates of the individuals who say they have a disability in the CPS data has dropped by more than half. It just tells me there's something going on there that, if you think work is good for people, and I think it is, I'm not just thinking of this on a budgetary standpoint, I think work is good for people, then that's something that should be sort of troubling. I agree with Paul that the decline in labor force participation is not purely a function of disability. I think it's probably larger than what he's saying. If you look at males, I think you can largely account for the decline in labor supply of an increase in number of people in disability. Much of the remainder is they ask people in the CPS, why are you not working? And they say, because I don't want a job. So neither of those are particularly encouraging things. The I don't want a job is a bigger category, but it's something that I think is a little bit worrying. There was an interesting study recently, Kevin Milligan, who's a Canadian economist, who looked at the kind of evolution of disability rates in Canada versus the US, because in some ways you have very similar labor markets, in other ways not so much. And what that concluded was that about a third of the increase in disability in the US was a function of either rising generosity of benefits in the US relative to Canadian levels, and also increases in income inequality, which means that the people at the bottom don't have as many options. And so I think it's it's a subtler story of what's going on, and so it's a much more, and I think this gets to an area where I disagree with Paul a little bit, of saying, well, retirement and disability, they're tightly integrated. Retirement, you work, they look at your birth certificate, they give you a benefit based on it. It's a very straightforward sort of thing. Disability has a lot more subtle forces going on that I think make it a tougher nut to crack in a policy sense. Another issue that Steve raised was, this is going to the actuarial opinion of the interaction of Social Security with the federal budget. Partly this comes down to kind of a baseline sort of religious disagreement between Social Security and the CBO about how you think about things. Steve is, of course, right. The literal interpretation of Social Security law, it is some sort of dogmatic schism or something. But it literally interprets it. okay, Social Security does not have the authority to pay benefits once the trust fund runs out. So the literal interpretation of the law is that, once the trust fund runs out, we cut benefits and there's no contribution to debt. It's correct. Lawyers will tell you, when I was at Social Security, we talked to lawyers and they said, well, that's correct. But it's an unrealistic interpretation, and I think it's so to be sanguine based on that interpretation is probably not very helpful. Thinking back to the Disability Trust Fund, I was at Social Security, we're all there. We've had years of research on disability saying, look, it's kind of a screwed up program. It needs substantive reforms in how it works. All along the way, you get people saying, well, the trust fund's solvent, we're good. Then, come last year, the trust fund's about to go insolvent, which would have, led to the benefit cuts, no increase in debt, blah, blah, blah. And then they say, well, let's just transfer money out of the retirement program into disability and we're all good. And so the narrative, I think, is such that, I'm not disagreeing with you in a technical sense, but the narrative is such that I think it's not a very helpful way of trying to get policymakers to grapple with programs that, to be honest, they really don't want to grapple with. So it's kind of the framing of how we think about this. Today we have, when the trustees report comes out, you get news reports saying, hey, Social Security is solvent for 75 years, or solvent for 17 years. At the end, even after that, we can still pay 75% of benefits. I guarantee you, come 2034, when we're looking at that, it will not be we can still pay 75% of benefits. It's the 25% benefit cut, the sky is falling. So I think we just, in terms of the framing of it, we want to think about how all that plays out. Steve gave some figures on replacement rates, which is an issue I could talk about all day long. I think for people, the importance there, the replacement rate tells you.
You could, but you can't.
Hey, I got 4 minutes and I'm going to use it. But the replacement rate frames how we think about Social Security, because what it tells you is your Social Security benefit as a percentage of your pre-retirement earnings. And the replacement rate is a very common way that financial planners or policymakers thinking about the adequacy of these benefits consider things. And the number, sort of your baseline number is 40%. The Social Security for the average earner replaces about 40% of their pre-retirement earnings. There's a whole variety of details on it. I had an article earlier this year in the Journal of Retirement for people who were interested in this stuff. But what I'll say is this. People in a kind of a financial planning approach or kind of a life cycle approach in economics, people are thinking about replacing their pre-retirement consumption. You want to have a steady standard of living from work into retirement. So if you were going to measure a replacement rate, you'd probably say, what is my Social Security benefit as a percentage of my average pre-retirement earnings adjusted for inflation? Because inflation tells you what your purchasing power was. The figures you're getting, what you used to have in the Social Security Trustees Report, now you get a supplementary publication. They compare your Social Security benefit to your pre-retirement earnings indexed for the rate of wage growth. That gives you a figure that's about 20% higher than your real average earnings. Literally what it tells you is it compares the benefit to a new retiree in this year to the earnings of the average worker in the workforce this year. That is a number, from a sort of financial planning standpoint, is a number which has basically no meaning. It just gives you a relative income between retirees and workers, but just doesn't tell you anything of real interest. So I think it's important we get those sorts of numbers right, because we're trying to think in terms of Social Security reform, we're trying to think of what makes sense of having this program work for people, but also something that's going to be affordable to people. So I think it's important to get those kinds of adequacy measures right. Finally, and I have 2 minutes, thinking big picture about what we do about Social Security. And Steve showed this, we just have a gap between what the benefits that we've promised to retirees and disabled and the taxes we've promised to workers. Those promises are going to be broken, both of which probably. But when I think big picture about this, there's details of how we do the formulas and all that, but big picture, you've got an aging society where the economy and the workers, a relatively smaller number of workers, has to support a relatively larger number of retirees. To do that, you prefer your workforce to be as productive as it can be. That means, as George W. Bush said, grow the pie, and it just makes it less of a zero-sum game. Now, I am confident that, roughly speaking, if we fix the problem for Social Security, the solvency problem, by raising taxes, you are either going to get less, lower labor supply, people working less because of higher taxes, or you're going to get lower saving. And you might get both, but it really depends. If you think your higher taxes are buying you more benefits in the future, if you believe the benefit promise, then you'll save less. You'll work the same, you'll save less. If you don't believe the taxes are going to get you extra benefits, then you'll see it as a pure tax and you'll work less because of it. So it just strikes me, if you want a more productive economy, that's kind of not the way to go. If we're thinking about cutting benefits, for most people, the studies seem to show that low-income people are not particularly sensitive to this kind of stuff. Middle and upper-income people are. If we're reducing benefits, at least on some gradual basis for them, they're going to react by tending to work more and save more. So to me, that takes the policy level for the system and I think mates it up a little bit more cleanly to what we're thinking about of this overall kind of economic issue we're facing with an aging population. And with that, 12 minutes and 3 seconds, I am done.
Thank you very much and for paying attention to your time. And thanks all for the good comments. I want to give Steve a chance to react to the comments of the discussants, maybe 3 or 4 minutes.
Great. Thanks, Alex. And I'll be careful here in how I react because, it was nice to get an invitation here. And I want to have the hope that that could happen again in the future. But just running down a couple of things that were mentioned here. First of all, on the replacement rates, I'm so glad, Andrew, that you mentioned that because the 1, 2, 3, fourth one up from the bottom on this list here, actuarial notes. Please go back and look. We did an actuarial note when this was really a hot topic about 3 years ago, and we did a comparison looking at a whole batch, looking at the entirety of all people retiring, starting retirement benefits into Social Security, and we looked at the median level of replacement rate. At the median level, and we looked at it by a number of different metrics. And in addition to the one that we think makes a lot of sense relative to, especially the way benefits are determined for this program, look at your AIME, your average wage indexed monthly earnings. We also looked at some other ones, including looking at the last 5 years in which you had any work, ignoring the very last one because that's probably on average a half a year work, so that doesn't count. So we looked at the 5 more distant of the last 6 years that you had any work. We looked at it both wage indexing and your preference, Andrew, CPI indexing those numbers, and the replacement rates that we got at median were like virtually identical to the ones we have by the wage indexed career. And the reason for that is because earnings late in career tend to be higher on a CPI index basis than they are for your career as an average. So it turned out that the last 5 real years of earnings that you have, even on a CPI index basis, turned out to be really quite close to what your career average on a wage index basis are. And again, there's some reason to want to look at that because that's the basis for actually determining your benefit level. A couple of other things. First of all,
Steve, I'll send you my article.
Okay. And I'll send you the link to our actual note.
I've read it.
Okay. So on allowance rates are really, really an interesting thing. We also have, dare I say, another actual note up there sort of mentioned about allowance rates. Allowance rates, again, and what we did is we looked at the allowance rate, if I'm recalling right on this, sort of over more than just going back to 2000. We looked back over several economic cycles. You can see that the overall allowance rate does tend to go up and down. And Paul is exactly right in pointing out particularly the ALJ allowance rate, which has really dropped so very much. We are quite sure that a portion of that, how much of it we don't really know, is because of cases that have come in and have applied more than we would expect in a strong economy. And remember, if people come and apply who are really, I think Andrew or somebody used the notion of a marginal case, a case that probably isn't going to qualify, but again, people are searching for every possibility. If they come and apply and they are denied benefits at the initial level, then they're denied at the reconsideration level. They have the opportunity and oftentimes will then go on and apply to the ALJ level. So we tend to end up actually in a poor economy where extra people are applying to have a concentration of people who are these marginal cases finding their way to the ALJ, which would temporarily drop the ALJ allowance rates. How much of this rather large drop from the low 60s down to the mid 40% is because of that we're not really sure. We're sort of paying attention. There are some other things going on there, but the overall allowance rate, combining it all together, has not varied dramatically from what we've seen in the past for overall fluctuations in economic. The other thing to keep in mind too is we do have the backlog situation, which we could talk about a little bit. labor force participation rates, I'm happy to share, Paul, that we've actually done a lot of work at this, including we had a recent Social Security Advisory Board tech panel that was looking at that, and we explained to them and have shown to others that for prime age males, which is where a lot of people pointed about that number coming down over the past 2 or 3 decades, our model basically explains the drop for prime age males, whether you take 45 to 65 or 25 to 54. Gary, and you've seen this, what it basically explains it within our model by a combination of increasing disability rates and changing marital status. And I found it especially interesting what Andrew was saying about people saying they don't want to get a job or something like this. Maybe it's because they don't have a spouse encouraging them to get a job. So there's been a big change in marital status.
Steve, that's sexist.
And that at least has a strong correlation with what's going on. Another thing too, just to mention about disability, Andrew was appealing to sort of disability prevalence in the population. A really important thing to keep in mind, and quite an interesting one, is that not until 1960 were people under the age of 50 allowed to come and apply for our disability benefits, and until the very late 60s did we modify our insured status so that people under 30 really had a chance of being able to apply for our benefits. So it wasn't until the late 1960s that people at age 20s, in their 20s, could apply for benefits, which means the cohorts of people 40 years later, around 2010, who are up at around age 60 to 65, they've only had a full lifetime opportunity to come and apply on our rolls as around 2010. So you would expect, even at those high ages, to have the prevalence of disability receipt of our benefits to have only grown up to its sort of ultimate level by that time. So just sort of an interesting little tidbit. The one final thing I did want to mention, and to go back to the depletion date, what you mentioned is sort of a philosophical kind of thing, Andrew. I'm glad that you do agree, though, whether or not you want to presume that which has never happened and is not permitted in the law and never has been, to pay for the shortfalls out of money just rolling in from the general fund of the Treasury. I would just suggest, if you want to presume that and put that forth as your expectation, be explicit. Say this presumes a change in law that we've never had before that will make that happen. And the other fact on that, really, and I think you were agreeing with this, Andrew, is that if you look at historically, when has Congress actually moved to act on making changes in Social Security? It has not been when we run cash flow negatives. It has not been when we're starting to redeem our trust fund bonds and start to run up the amount of publicly held debt. It has been when the trust funds are approaching depletion and members of Congress might see their constituents seeing a reduction in benefits. So really, it has been the motivating factor, and I would say we should be careful about, at the same time, saying that Social Security benefits won't be payable after the reserve depletion date. But nonetheless, by paying all of them, they're going to run up gigantic amounts of debt. You really have to go with one of those or the other. You can't be putting both of those stories forward. That really is it. Yes.
Thank you. I want to give Paul and Andrew a chance to a couple minutes if there's anything else you want to add. Go ahead, Paul.
I think it's better to go to the audience.
We're going to give Andrew a chance, though.
Okay.
Any further comments, Andrew?
Steve.
I'll duck.
As I said, I'll talk all the way. I'll touch on the replacement rate, because this is something I think is very important. If you go back and look at the OACT memo, which is worth looking at, it's interesting stuff, but if you calculate, when it calculates, say, a full career replacement rate, say if somebody's 35 or 40-year career, they'll include years in which they have zero earnings, which are common throughout people's careers. And that gives you kind of a 40% number on this wage indexed basis. The figures, these sort of final earnings replacement rates they're doing, basically exclude years of zero earnings. Now that would be, I think, justifiable if zero earnings were really clustered at the end of people's careers, but you don't have them in the rest. But people have zero earnings years all through their lifetime. And again, if you think of it from kind of a life cycle approach, people should gauge their consumption based on what their average income is over time, not, they don't go up and down based on their earnings each year. So, you should, to be consistent, you should calculate, you should include zeros. What I'll say, I'll ask you just take look at average earnings, say from age 50 to 65, 50 to 62 or something like that. Just, look at them for the full, population of people. Then look at the benefits those folks receive when they retire. The number, divide them out, the number is not going to be 40%. It's going to be a lot higher than that. And you can go fairly long periods before retirement, and you'll just, if people are gauging their standard of living late in life based on their average earnings, it's the adequacy of Social Security is a lot higher relative to that than versus these kind of tweaked numbers that I don't think get at the economic reality. And I think that's important for the policy debate over where we want Social Security to go.
Obviously, we could discuss this a lot more, but I do want to come to questions. But I want to take the prerogative of asking a question first. Nobody on the panel talked about retirement age as a factor. So as the full retirement age rises, obviously, income of the program rises and cost falls. So what can we say about the role of increasing retirement age along with increasing longevity in these projections in the outlook?
I think it's important to say, first of all, that we have to distinguish between there are two retirement ages in Social Security, if you will. The early eligibility age, the first age at which you can start claiming retirement benefits, which is 62, and the full retirement age, which is now which is moving up to 67, the year at which you can claim full benefits. And as Steve mentioned, there's our actuarially based reductions for claiming benefits earlier than the full retirement age. Now, it turns out that arithmetically, an increase in the full retirement age is simply an across-the-board cut in benefits. If we were to raise the full retirement age, say, by another year to 68, that would be equivalent to a 7 or 8% further cut in benefits across the board. So if that is what one's talking about, sometimes that's described as an increase in the retirement age, and in a sense it is, but you have to realize it doesn't have anything to do really with people's retirement. It's just a way of producing an across-the-board cut in benefits. It's also not necessarily, it could contribute to the goal that Andrew has espoused, namely encouraging people to work longer, because obviously if you get a lower benefit at age 62, that's going to produce somewhat of a disincentive to claim at that age. But we still see, even though the claiming at age 62 has shrunk, it's still, I guess, the most common or one of the most common claiming ages, because a lot of people just feel they don't want to or can't keep working beyond that. We also see that, in fact, as you saw on the slide in my package about labor force participation at higher ages is increasing. It's declining at somewhat younger ages, but for people above 60 and even above 65, it's actually going up. And some of that, I suspect, is a result of the increase in the Social Security full retirement age, this cut in Social Security benefits. Some of it is just as a natural response, as I guess Alex pointed out. If you're going to live a longer time in retirement, you may not want to, you may want to have a bigger kitty, so to speak, of retirement savings to start out with. So I think, whether or not, we want to have an across-the-board cut in, I'm not a fan of across-the-board benefit cuts, so I'm not a fan of increasing the full retirement age. I think if we want to cut benefits, there are better ways to do it, but it certainly is something which is going to be considered.
Go ahead, yes, please.
Yeah, could I just add, actually the top one that we had on the slide that we kind of ran through quick is in fact a further change in the so-called normal retirement age or full retirement age, take your pick. And we characterize it, by the way, as being, it is an across-the-board benefit reduction, you might say, for people who are first starting the benefits as retirees. But one of the aspects of increasing the retirement age is that it still provides, unless you make some other adjustment, it still provides availability of the disabled worker benefits, which are not reduced for age. So actually what happens when you increase the normal retirement age is we do lower the cost of retirement and survivor benefits, but you actually increase the total cost for disability. And because we have two different trust funds, you got to keep that in mind. So if you're paying attention to the difference between the trust funds, you're actually doing some cost shifting over to DI. One other thing just to keep in mind about increasing the normal retirement age, The 1983 amendment said, let's just kick it up by 2 years over a period of time. That was looked at as something to save a certain amount of money, and a recognition that it had not been changed since 1940 when benefits first started for the full retirement age. There are a number of ways of looking at it. One of the most popular has been to look at the program and basically index the program or insulate it from further increases in longevity. Remember, this is just increasing longevity, not affecting the effects of the age distribution from birth rates. And a way to do that is to simply say, well, what if after we get to 67, for people reaching 62 in 2022, if we raise the normal retirement age for succeeding generations after that by enough so that the life expectancy at the new normal retirement age divided by the number of potential work years from 20 up to that normal retirement age, keep that ratio the same over time. And that's one way of potentially indexing that, and many people put forth that proposal. We've got that again scored on our website. And that would save about a fourth of the long-term shortfall.
I've said that, Steve, as measuring age not as birth plus X, but as expected death minus Y. And that's not a benefit cut. We could talk about that. Let me come to your questions, ladies and gentlemen. And may I remind you of the AEI rules. Please wait until the microphone comes to you. When you get the microphone, tell us your name and your affiliation. If you feel strongly the urge to make a lecture before you get to your question, if you go on for more than 1 minute, the chair will remind you to come to your question.
Okay.
I'm going to call right on this gentleman first, and we'll come up here and then to you. Okay.
Holzer, I'm with the Center on Capital and Social Equity, which I created to promote financial inclusion. I think the focus on the replacement rate and the differential is good, but and it's good that it's progressive, but it's kind of deceptive. And when you compare, even if there's a big differential between the low wage worker and the high wage, the median payout of Social Security is not too far above poverty level. Healthcare costs are increasing, and the people at the top of the distribution have a lot more returns from capital in the form of defined contribution and pensions. And those differences are magnifying. The people at the bottom don't even have access to pensions. So you're only looking at one leg of the three-legged stool. And I think, if I remember, the Bipartisan Policy Commission did address both issues. They do boost income, Social Security at the bottom, and they do try to make participation in DC plans more universal. Just to react to that. Sorry if it was too long.
Let me just
Okay,
comment
thanks.
that not only the most recent Bipartisan Policy Center proposal, but the one back in 2010 and many others have changed our benefit formula, which, as you indicated, is progressive. It gives a higher benefit compared to your lifetime earnings for lower earners than higher earners. And I believe the BPC recent proposal extended that a little bit. We have a 90, 32, 15 percentage brackets. And a lot of proposals come on that would raise the 90 a little bit to be even a little bit higher than that, to give a little bit larger benefit at the bottom. I believe the BPC proposal also included some enhancements to minimum benefit considerations too for long career low earners.
Okay, right here. Oh, I'm sorry, Andrew.
Sure,
Oh,
I'll just touch on it quickly. I mean, it's, if you Social Security is a progressive system, and it's if you look at the benefits paid out to somebody who's a maximum wage worker who earns it's now $127,000 a year and earns that throughout their career, and that's big picture, that's a very high income person versus what Steve's office terms of very low wage worker who earns about a quarter of the average wage. That's about the bottom 20% of your retiree population. Social Security benefits are about 3.5 in relative terms, relative to your wages, relative to what you paid in. Social Security benefits are about 3.5 times more generous for the very low wage worker than they are for the maximum wage worker. So you shouldn't be surprised to see much higher saving rates, in 401ks or other pensions by people who have high incomes and people with low incomes. I mean, it's a perfectly rational response to things. The question is, a lot of what you're talking about gets to value judgments, and I don't really have much to add on that. But I think you're right if you wanted to think big picture about, people are preparing for retirement. They're not just thinking about Social Security completely distinct from everything else. So I think a big picture approach is the correct one.
Thank you. Okay, here, please.
Okay, John Turner, Pension Policy Center. My question is about the implications of this discussion about insolvency and possible future benefit cuts for the Social Security benefit statement. And it's primarily for Andrew and Paul as your recommendations of Social Security, but I don't want to cut you out, Steve. You're welcome to comment. The Social Security benefit statement currently assumes that there will be no benefit cuts. So it is counter to the legal requirement that there will be benefit cuts if there's no reform. Of course, nobody knows what the reform will contain, but I think that many people likely think that it will include benefit cuts. So my question is to Andrew and Paul, do you have any recommendations for a better way of communicating on the Social Security benefit statement the possibility that the benefits that are the scheduled benefits will not be paid and that they actually will be reduced because of a reform? Is there like maybe a number or maybe just a statement to that effect or something like that?
Well, my recollection, and Steve perhaps can correct me if I'm wrong, is that the text of the statement, either in the message from the commissioner or in some other way, does indicate that this financing problem is on the horizon. I don't recall if it explicitly talks about how much benefits might have to be cut if to stick, to fit within scheduled revenues. But it seems to me that while one could doubtless, or perhaps improve the language, maybe to make it a little bit more explicit, that the statement is basically attempting to do that as it is. I think, of course, one of the concerns is that a lot of people say in a very offhand way, oh, Social Security isn't going to be around at all when I retire. That may be the greater misconception that has to be corrected, and certainly the statement, I think, contributes to, to clarifying that misconception, since I think even, if I may say so, even Andrew would agree that Social Security is going to be around in the future in some way, shape,
yes.
in some way, shape, or form.
I think I have some good news for you, John. The statement gives you an estimate of what your future benefit is going to be. The statement used to say, this figure is in today's dollars. The figure on your statement actually isn't in today's dollars, meaning adjusted for inflation. It's deflated back by the rate of wage growth, which again goes to some of these oddball replacement rate issues. But there's good news for you. What it means is that in real inflation-adjusted terms, it understates your benefits by about 1% for every year between the time you receive the statement and the time you're going to retire. Now here's the twist. What this results in, if you were to fix Social Security's actuarial deficit by what's called price indexing of benefits, where instead of letting initial benefits rise with wage growth, you freeze them in real terms, and that's almost enough to fix the whole deficit. The amount on your statement would be just about correct. So even if they fix it entirely by cutting benefits, as long as they do it in an orderly way, your statement figure is good. If they do it by cutting 25% in 2034, then all bets are off. But I just think that's so unlikely that. But I believe the statement does, or at one point it had some sort of asterisk saying, well, these are promised benefits, they may not be fully payable. If I remember right from when we were all at SSA, some members of Congress would give the agency grief over that, saying you're trying to scare people or whatever. Mm-hmm. Who knows?
I think your question is very interesting. I think we should turn the statement over to the SEC and make the Social Security write a risk factors paragraph like in a prospectus. I think I had a... Go ahead, and then we're going to come to your question.
I believe the statement, it currently does, and it has for a long time, indicated the point of reserve depletion, and that these are scheduled benefits. We always think in terms of laws enacted by the Congress are statements of intent. They're not your promises, because we know that same Congress and succeeding Congresses can always change it. So they're statements of intent. These are intended benefits, and could they change? And I believe that the statement indicates reserve depletion and that the benefits may not be at that level.
Thank you. I have a question right here, please.
Hello, my name is Dalton Booker. I'm a program associate at the Osgood Center for International Studies, and I guess this is theoretically more of a tax policy question, though certainly Mr. Biggs brought that up towards the end of his statement. And so, as you said, if we raise these taxes, we'll run into an issue with people working less and saving less. And I was wondering if you would think that increasing effective revenue without increasing written tax rate by cutting out some of the exceptions that we make on the tax code, both that really every American uses, but particularly some people at the more wealthy end, and raising revenue that way, if you think that would have a similar effect, and in general, how viable of a solution do you think that is?
Could I just ask, do you have specific examples of exemptions that you would propose to eliminate? Because there's a lot of them, and it might make a lot of difference which ones you're thinking of.
There are too many of them, and I don't know any of them off the top of my head, but I agree that there are many, many, many.
Home mortgage.
A couple of proposals from Senator Sanders, Congressman Larson would expand the ACA's tax and investment income and use that to fund Social Security. It's a way of getting, people are getting income from investments, not from wages. There's other proposals, Steve would know, that would subject employer-provided health benefits to payroll taxes. That would broaden the base. I think it would actually be progressive as well, and I think it would solve some of our healthcare problems in the sense of getting rid of some of the implicit subsidy towards overconsumption of healthcare. But it's Social Security is kind of a self-contained system. It's designed to look a little bit like a private pension system, and so when you go to that, you lose some of the simplicity and clarity of it. But obviously, you're able to address other things that people want to get at.
Yeah, Andrew mentions a very important one. In fact, it was, I believe, in a plan called the Roadmap by Paul Ryan back around 2010, that he put forth the notion of, for Social Security purposes, and I believe that bipartisan policy centers, I don't know if the latest one did, but the one prior did, suggest that we would have employer-sponsored group health insurance premiums subject to one or both of Social Security payroll taxes by including them in as if they were wages, and also having them in for income taxes. And that would make a big difference. It would add a lot to the tax base. In terms of the progressivity, if they were subject to adding into your earnings for payroll tax purposes, and we retained the $127,200 limit, then people already making that much in wages, of course, wouldn't pay anything extra, because there wouldn't be any tax on the value of their employer-sponsored group health insurances. But if somebody's making $50,000, if they had $15,000 worth of health insurance, then they would in fact pay more taxes. So it'd be, you probably wouldn't want to say it's progressive.
But no,
Paul,
doesn't it play out on the benefit end?
A brief comment, and then I'm going to try to
just
fit in
one
one
note.
more
I also
question.
have to note a slight disagreement with Andrew here. While obviously as a card-carrying economist, I certainly think that marginal tax rates are going to have some effect on work effort. I'm not as worried about that as Andrew is. The U.S., as most of you probably know, is a very low-tax country compared to most high-income countries. So I think there is some room for raising payroll or other taxes without having a terribly adverse effect.
But we agree on the sign, though.
We agree on the sign, sure.
Okay, well, I'm going to take one more question, and right here, please, and that will be it.
I'm Delmer Hoskins from the Social Security Administration. Among the possible solutions to our future problems of financing, of course, you mentioned raising the retirement age, but I am always intrigued by the fact that we rarely talk about increasing the number of years that you would have to work to have a full benefit under the Social Security program. A number of countries have done this almost surreptitiously, because it's a good way of doing reform without really upsetting the public too much. And they've gradually moved from 35 years to 37 to 38 to 40. I think in France now it's up to 42. It's going to rise to 45. It seems that that's not very much on the radar screen for the American debate. Any reaction from the
Panel, how about raising number of working years required?
Yeah, I should say, I can't remember precisely which proposals, but raising the averaging period from the current 35 years to 38 or 40 has been a feature of a number of proposals. Is that in yours, Jim? It's in the Bipartisan Policy Center plan, for example. It is a way of cutting benefits. I think the one thing to keep in mind is that, however, it tends not to be progressive. Because relatively high-income people, like those of us who are sitting in front of you, tend not to have many or any years of zero earnings, whereas low-income people are much more likely to have years of zero earnings. So if you're going to do that, that is increase the averaging period, and if you're concerned about progressivity, you may need to combine that with other changes to offset the effect of changing the averaging period.
Delmer, I've also been concerned, this is going back a few years, but looking at the incentives to continue working for people close to retirement. Under the way the rules are currently constructed, most men who reach retirement age have 35 years of earnings. And so if they work an additional year and they pay an additional 12.4% in taxes, the marginal effect on their benefits is basically zero. It's very, very small. And so I was saying, well, how do you improve that? One of the oddball things of going to 40 is that it's supposed to improve incentives while you can earn additional benefit. But I think for people who retire with less than 35 years of earnings, which is going to be lower income people and a lot of women, it reduces the marginal gain from working longer, because an extra year, instead of increasing your benefit by 1/35th, increases it by 1/40th or 1/45th. So it's something, if you'd asked me in the past, I'd be like, yeah, why not, makes sense. But actually, when you start digging through it, I'm not sure it really does what I'd want it to do.
Steve, you get the last comment.
Okay, not making any value judgment, but there are two kinds of proposals that really actually do affect this. As Delmer knows, and probably most people in this room know, your computation period for a retiree is the number of years from age 22 up to the point of your eligibility for retirement, which is 40 years, less 5 dropout years. And one approach that is taken, and I believe this is probably the latest Bipartisan Policy Center approach, and many others have said, let's just reduce the number of dropout years and have more than 35 of those 40 years be the number that you have to include. Now, another way that's a little bit less obvious is any proposal that we've scored that would increase the earliest eligibility age, 62. We have assumed, and generally members of Congress have assumed, that if we increase the 62 up to, say, 65, that would automatically increase that elapsed period from 40 to 43 years. And if we have 5 dropout years, that would increase the computation period from 35 up to 38 years. So this consideration is there, but Andrew's points are well taken, that if you change this, and by the way, I guess for the highest earners that have more than 35 years of earnings, if we expanded, it's true they're not getting any extra credit for the years beyond 35 that they're paying in, but if we expanded the averaging period, that would actually lower their benefit, because the extra years that would be included at the averaging period would be obviously lower than the highest 35 we're taking now, and it would actually lower the benefit. So I'm not sure they'd want to be getting that extra credit, which would lower their benefits for the extra years of work that they had.
They wouldn't prefer it now.
Thank you for the very knowledgeable and interesting comments by all. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for coming, and let's show our appreciation for the panel.